All right, 1 o'clock. Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Benjamin Weinthal, journalist for the Jerusalem Post and research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, join us to discuss Germany's increasing support of a pro-Iranian regime. Mr. Weinthal will speak for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Benjamin Weinthal.
Okay, thanks, Stacey, and thanks for all those who are on the call. And I welcome questions. Good questions are better than good answers, and this is a big topic in light of the fact that Germany's the most, I would argue, zealous champion of the nuclear deal that's about to be concluded in Vienna right now to curb the Iranian regime's illicit nuclear weapons program in exchange for sanctions relief. And the reports that are coming out suggest that the US and the other world powers gave away the store, and Iran's going to reap a lot of benefits that'll help the regime in Tehran advance its terrorism and its support of Russia and other totalitarian regimes. So I'd like to back up to 1984 just to give folks a sense of Germany's long-standing policy of soggy appeasement toward the Islamic Republic of Iran. In 1984, Germany's then Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher pursued a policy of called trade to bring about change. So the idea is not was to incentivize the newly formed Islamic Republic of Iran, because this was only 5 years after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, to engage in trade with a view toward modifying its human rights repression. The real policy and the joke at the time was it really wasn't a way to change Iran, but the Germans and other Europeans, for example, Austria, were meeting with the dictatorship in Tehran in order to spend instead of spending their time trying to convince Iran's regime to not repress its population, they spent their time bashing the Americans and American foreign policy. And that policy of trade via trade with a view toward changing Iran's jingoistic and anti-human rights policies has largely remained the same, as we can see in Vienna right now. And Germany's been, as I said, the proponent of that policy. Germany has traditionally been the largest trade partner in Europe with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and there have been reports, or I've been reporting on for almost 20 years now, about how German companies, mainly mid-level engineering companies, provide parts and technology to Iranian companies in the regime that help keep the regime's infrastructure on life support. Germany still uses banks, including the European Iranian Trade Bank in Hamburg, to make payments to the regime. And during the Trump administration, the administration of Chancellor Angela Merkel actually sent diplomats, or one diplomat, to a sanctions busting seminar to advise companies how to circumvent US sanctions. At the time, the US ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, told me, and I reported on this, that the participants at that meeting should be sanctioned. Richard Grenell actually was one of arguably the most assertive US diplomat in roping in Germany's pro or accommodationist or appeasement policies. He got the Germans to sanction Mahan Airlines, which is a terrorist airline that supplied Assad's regime in Syria with funds and military equipment, and got the Germans to bar the regime from using that airline to land in Germany. And he also convinced, via pressure, of course, and the use of American power, to secure Germany's decision to outlaw all of the Iranian regime-backed terrorist organization Hezbollah, where there are well over 1,000 Hezbollah operatives in Germany, still are, but on paper, Hezbollah's terrorism activities are barred, and Germany has a whole new set of legal and law enforcement tools that can crack down on Hezbollah's activities, including, if the Germans choose to, ban Hezbollah mosques and associations from sending funds to Beirut, which they do to help advance the Iranian regime's revolutionary ideology. So there have been cases recently of Germany, and I think this is important. I've done some reporting on this, of supplying technology to Iran that was used in the Syrian war. For example, several years ago, I reported on a German company in Baden-Württemberg, the southwestern state of Baden-Württemberg in Germany, that has a lot of these highly advanced engineering companies, and they sent a company there called Krempel sent material to two Iranian businessmen in Tehran, and this material was later, this technology was later used in Iranian manufactured chemical rockets that poisoned about 19 people in one strike in Syria. And it was reported on, and they found the Made in Germany logo on this technology. And it was somewhat of a scandal, but again, Germany's government told me there was no illicit activity involved, and the German government, actually their export agency, approved the transfer of technology, this type of dual-use technology that was used to poison Syrians. So the bottom line is the West, I consider Germany the West's worst ally, because as you saw with the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany banned Britain from delivering weapons to Ukraine, banned Britain from using German airspace. Germany has been carrying Vladimir Putin's water for decades. And I would argue they're carrying the water of Ali Khamenei since the death, since the late 80s. Germany's policy hasn't changed because the business of Germany is business and exports. And they're more concerned about prioritizing their exports to Iran and aiding Iran and its oil industry than about ensuring human rights or about ensuring that Iran won't build a nuclear weapons device. The new German chancellor was in Israel just a few days ago, and Olaf Scholz from the Social Democratic Party, and he issued the usual statement that the time's running out, or Iran's regime has to make a decision right now in Vienna about the deal, et cetera, and that Germany stands on the side of Israel. As folks might remember, in 2008, Chancellor Merkel gave a talk here in Jerusalem, where I am at right now, and declared that Israel's security is non-negotiable, and Israel's security interests are part of Germany's national security interests. But that rhetoric, of course, is empty rhetoric, as we've seen, because Merkel and her successor, I would argue, are largely concerned about maximizing trade. And the current trade relationship is in the billions, but Germany expected the trade relationship after the JCPOA was negotiated, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. Analysts in Germany expected trade to reach over 10 billion. a year. And it's possible now that this deeply concessionary and flawed deal will be settled in Vienna, that trade could reach those numbers, and that's money that will obviously pay for, help Tehran with its terrorism in the region and against Israel, and I would argue in Germany, where the Islamic Republic of Iran paid a Pakistani man in Bremen to surveil German Israeli institutions and pro-Israeli institutions and Jewish organizations. And according to one German media report, he was paid by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards Corps, to assassinate an Israeli, a French Israeli citizen, or someone else connected to Israel. I reported on this a number of years ago. Germany refused to sanction Tehran over this assassination attempt on its soil. The Pakistani terrorist was convicted and is serving a minor sentence in a German prison. But again, it shows you the appeasement policy that Germany simply rebuked or reprimanded privately the Iranian ambassador to Germany, but took no sanctions or didn't sanction the Iranian government in any way. They didn't even, Germany wasn't even willing to call back its ambassador from Tehran. So there are also all sorts of appeasement policies that are taking place. There are multiple Germans who are being held right now in Iranian prisons, and the German government has refused to use its leverage to secure the release of these German citizens. For example, there's one gentleman by the name of, and I've been writing about his case for over a year now, Jamshid Sharmahad, who was kidnapped by Iran's regime in over a year ago in the UAE, and he's facing the death penalty. He was kidnapped, and the German government has played it very close to the vest and won't say what they're doing. And I strongly suspect they're doing nothing, because if they were doing something, they would use their economic leverage to secure the release of him and the other Germans who are currently being held. The other German who's currently being held captive in Tehran. So this is part of it. I guess what I'm saying is the Germany's appeasement policy expands into all walks of life, as one can see, and it's a highly dangerous game, and it's jeopardizing, in my view, the security of the European Union, the Middle East, and the United States, of course, also global security. Just as Germany's highly dangerous pro-Putin policy jeopardized the security of the EU, as we're seeing right now, via Germany's embrace of the Nord Stream 2 energy project that benefited Putin's regime, and also it's Germany's consumption of Russian gas, which benefits Putin and aids him in his invasion of Ukraine. So there has to be a dramatic shift in German policy toward Iran. That has to happen within the voting sector of Germany. Germans have to decide to vote in politicians who are anti-Iranian regime, and have to internalize, in my view, the larger public, the dangers of Iran's regime. Perhaps in light of what's happened with Putin, more Germans will view Iran as a fundamentally dangerous regime that needs to be dissolved. At the end of the day, that will take place in Iran, and ordinary Iranians will bring about the dissolution of the clerical regime. But Germany certainly could help, and it could help in connection with democracy promotion. And it's done the antithesis. It's celebrated Iran's regime, as I've reported on. In Berlin, each year there's an event at Tehran's embassy in Berlin where the Iranians celebrate the Islamic Revolution, and the German foreign ministry sends diplomats to this event to celebrate the Islamic Revolution and all that embodies, including its anti-Americanism and its genocidal anti-Semitism. It's a scandal, but there aren't enough Germans at this point within the voting public to tip the balance to change this type of policy by voting for politicians who, as I said, are vehemently opposed to the clerical regime and appeasement policies of the German government. So that's sort of a 15-minute snapshot version of what I consider to be sort of a form of uber soggy appeasement on the part of Germany's governments toward the Islamic Republic of Iran, and why Germany is largely the main European actor who's been keeping the Islamic Republic of Iran on life support. And Germany is such a key player. And the current Biden administration, much to my acute frustration, disappointment, has not pushed Germany to crack down on Iran or urge Germany to take a stronger position in light of Iran's gross human rights violations. So thanks for listening. As I said, fire away with questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have quite a few questions coming in. The first one from Kenneth Miller. How has the Ukrainian crisis and the NATO boycott of Russian oil affected Germany's and other countries' decisions in regards to the Iranian agreement?
It's a good question. Thank you, Kenneth. Thus far, it hasn't changed the German calculus toward Iran's regime. Again, much to my frustration. I don't think, in short, Germany hasn't learned the lessons of the Holocaust. And the Russian example, I think, was the most telling example because, Germany, as I mentioned, refused to allow Britain to deliver weapons in the lead up to the war by banning the United Kingdom from using its airspace. Now, to Germany's credit, it did do a 180 now, and it did send some weapons to the Ukraine. But I just read a report, or a headline, I should say, a few sentences in the Bild, Germany's largest paper, that many of these weapons are defective. They're from the former East German communist state, from that arsenal. So it's kind of, as one political reporter said, oh, the thought was nice, but the weapons don't work. So it isn't a great, should be a great source of embarrassment. Now, Germany did pull the plug on the Nord Stream 2 energy project again, but it took, a war that was that could lead to, Putin invading other NATO countries, and it's encroaching on Germany's border. But for years, I've been writing about the dangers of this Nord Stream 2 project and why it should be canceled. And other lone voices out there, like Garry Kasparov, the chess player, and some others, Senator Ted Cruz has done tremendous work in this area, have also urged, and Richard Grenell, as I mentioned, and the Trump administration was opposed to the Nord Stream 2 energy project. But the Germans refused to listen. In fact, the German ambassador, I should mention, is Emily Haber, Haber, in the US, aggressively lobbied in Congress via letters and meetings for the Nord Stream project to take place. I think the American government right now should evict Emily Haber from the US, given her pro-Putin policy and what she did in terms of championing Putin in the halls of Congress.
Absolutely. Eric follows up with that. Are you surprised that Germany has freezed the pipeline from Russia? Does this indicate that Germany is dramatically changing?
I am somewhat surprised that the Germans froze or suspended the Nord Stream 2 energy project. I thought they would suspend it, the German government, during the actual war. So that they did it a few days before the actual invasion, or actually, I think and I have to look at the exact date. I mean, Russia has already invaded eastern Ukraine, so the invasion has already been in place for since 2014. But the full-scale invasion, I guess, is what I'm talking about. I expected the suspension to take place during the full-scale invasion. And to their credit, they did suspend it. Now, whether that they're going to permanently abolish the Nord Stream 2 energy project still up in the air. One would hope that they completely scrap the project, and they made a very foolish decision when the German government under Merkel, when they closed all of their nuclear power facilities and turned to Vladimir Putin as the sole source of their, or as the main source, I should argue, of their energy and their future energy requirements. So that was just extremely short-sighted, and it's one hopes that that Germany has learned its lesson with Vladimir Putin. I tend to think so, but again, the rapid-fire change of thinking in Germany is also quite disturbing. That from one moment they can go from being largely pro-Putin, according to attitude surveys and government policies, and then anti-Putin based on the invasion. And who knows what happens if Putin recoils in some way. It's always possible that Germany could go back to being largely pro-Putin and embrace the Nord Stream 2 energy project. I guess what I'm saying is that the lack of consistency in German foreign policy toward totalitarian regimes is very unsettling. I consider Germany, as I mentioned, to be the worst ally within the West, the worst ally within NATO, as bad as Turkey, and the worst ally within the EU. And if you look at their policies, Germany has, and I've been writing about this for years, has largely been pro-Islamic Republic of Iran, pro-communist China, and pro-Putin. Now Putin's out of the equation, but Germany's still in the camps of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Communist Party in China.
Understood. Thank you. Eric also asked, how can we enter the Iranian agreement with Russia as a partner while we are in a sanction war with Russia? Can you please discuss what details you know of the proposed deal?
Well, I don't have any access to the elements of the new deal other than what I've seen on social, sort of coming out on social media and Twitter and different reports from folks who have access to diplomats in the State Department who are in a state of panic over Rob Malley's, that's the U.S. envoy who's leading the negotiations, his concessions to Iran, which I've read include delisting the IRGC, the Islamic Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, as a terrorist entity. The Trump administration designated this organization as a terrorist organization, and delisting all sorts of other Iranian regime officials as terrorists, and of course, lifting all the sanctions on oil. And then I believe I saw the Transportation Secretary, Mayor Pete, declare, if I'm not mistaken, that the U.S. is in the business of wanting to buy Iranian oil. Now, I find all of this just shocking because, A, the IRGC was responsible, as folks know, I'm sure on this call, for murdering over 600 American military personnel in the Middle East. And why would the U.S. buy Iranian oil that when the profits will be used to inflict terrorism on the U.S. and its allies? So the U.S. right now is a deeply confused, has a deeply confused government that's spiraling out of control and doesn't understand who its enemies are. And as I mentioned, is also in the business, and this is a similarity between Germany and the U.S. right now, of soggy appeasement toward Iran's regime. The U.S. wants to kick the can down the road, as previous administrations have done with Iran, and cut a deal quickly with Iran's regime because they don't want to pick a fight. The U.S. is in the business now of turning inward and avoiding a strong presence on the global stage, which in my view is a mistake because it always comes back to haunt us in the U.S. As we saw with other forms of neo-isolationism. And the Iranian regime is in the business of exporting its revolution. So while the U.S. turns inward, the Iranian regime turns outward. And what will it do with the expected 90 or over $100 billion it will receive as part of this this wretched deal in Vienna? One can imagine, as we've seen based on past behavior, increased terrorism in the Middle East, increased terrorism around the world from Iran's regime, more assassinations of Iranian dissidents, more kidnappings of Iranian dissidents, a stronger alliance with Vladimir Putin's Russia and communist China to stymie American interests around the world. So one hopes that Congress will, blunt or try to find a way to stop this Iranian deal, but Biden has not made it subject to congressional approval, and there's no transparency about the deal either, based on what we're seeing right now in terms of what's being negotiated.
Sorry, I lost my mouse. All right, a follow-up for that. Chuck Falk asks, what is motivating the 5+1 to renew the JCPOA agreement, in your opinion?
That's a good question, Chuck. Well, these are all good questions. The motivation is the West, in my view, or at least the Western powers that are part of the deal, many of them are interested in trade with Iran. For example, France and Britain and Germany, they have sort of vested economic interest in revitalizing their economic partnerships with Iran, and Iran being having the second largest reserve of oil in the world. These countries, Germany and France and Britain, have important economic interests. Royal Dutch Shell, which is partly owned by Britain, certainly is starved to get back into Iran. And Germany, as I said, has a massive amount of economic activity with Iran, from its car industry, Mercedes-Benz, and other automobile parts and companies, to oil and providing all sorts of equipment for Iran's liquid natural gas production, etc. And there's also this severe fatigue on the part of the West to capitulate to Iran's demands, because the West does not want to engage in a military fight with Iran, and they're not willing to embrace a maximum sanctions campaign strategy that could ultimately lead to the collapse of the regime. So the West has opted for, I would argue, a form of public humiliation and capitulation, and that policy simply involves, we don't want Iran to race to creating a nuclear weapons device within the short term, in the next 6 months or a year. So we'll engage in this this ephemeral deal that'll last, a few years, and prevent Iran from building. At least we think it'll prevent Iran from building a nuclear weapons device within a period of a few years or 10 years, whatever the short-term duration is, and then we can sort of run down the halls as cheerleaders and declare victory. But it's an ephemeral victory, in the sense that it's appeasement, and that the long-term realization of this deal is to deliver a nuclear weapons device to Iran, not prevent and allow Iran to develop highly enriched uranium that will allow it to build a nuclear weapon. So I see it as part of all these different factors coming together. And of course, Russia and China simply want to cut a deal because they're largely aligned with Iran's regime, and they see Iran as an ally, and also as an incredibly important trade partner. For example, China consumes huge amounts of Iranian oil and has played a key role in busting U.S. sanctions right now, targeting Iran's regime. And there's, again, there are striking parallels between what's happening in Russia right now and Iran. The West has spent 20 years placating Putin and appeasing Putin. And you just have to read Garry Kasparov's 2015, his book, Winter's Coming. He lays it all out about how placating Putin is not going to work and Putin's going to invade Ukraine. And Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has the same playbook. It's just, that's how dictators work. I don't think it's anything intellectually more complex than that. And the West is simply utterly feeble and running scared right now of people like Khamenei and Putin and other totalitarian leaders. So they choose the path of cutting deals where dictatorships don't honor treaties or deals. And that's, I don't think it's a question of being naive from the West. I do think they simply don't have the fire in their belly right now, they being the Western powers, to confront Khamenei. So we're going to end up with a regime in Tehran that has a nuclear weapons device.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we head out, can you let our viewers know where we can find some more of your work?
Sure. Do we have time to take some more of the questions, or is it?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's just a half-hour program.
Okay. Well, again, thanks a lot for inviting me for the Middle East Forum, and Daniel Pipes. Please send my regards to that, Dr. Pipes. And thanks for initially, I think we had over 100 participants on the call, for carving out time to hear me to deliver some clinically depressing news to the participants about Iran's regime. My writings you can find, or what I've written about Germany and Iran, are largely on the website of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and at the Jerusalem Post. Both those websites contain most of my writings about Germany and German-Iranian relations. And there's I don't know, I've probably written hundreds of thousands of words about the same topic, but it all comes down to, in the end, soggy appeasement. That's the running thread. So from the German end toward Iran. So again, thanks for having me on the program, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we could go on for another, God knows how long. This is definitely a very relevant topic. All right. Well, we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Mr. Weinthal, for joining us today. For our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinars offering email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.
Great. Thanks. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Bye.
Bye.